In the freezing dawn of November 12, 1944, a wounded American soldier was screaming for help from the middle of a minefield, somewhere between the German and American lines in the Ridden forest. He had run there in a retreat, and now he couldn't move, and he couldn't be reached. The Germans, dug in just yards away, could hear every word, and the 23-year-old officer in command of that stretch of the forest, a man who had every reason in the world to simply let an enemy soldier die where he lay, gave an order instead. That order, and what he did next, would lead American veterans back to this same patch of Germany 50 years later to build him a monument. This is the story of Lieutenant Friedrich Lengfeld, 23 years as old, and the single act that made him the only German soldier of the Second World War, honored with a memorial raised by the men who had been trying to kill him. By November 1944, the Ridden forest had become one of the worst places on earth to be a soldier, American or German. 50 square miles of dense fir trees, steep ravines, and mud, sitting on the German-Belgian border. It would become the longest battle ever fought on German soil, and the second longest in the entire history of the United States Army, surpassed only by Bataan. Before it ended, in early 1945, American forces would suffer more than 30,000 casualties, by some instances as many as 55,000, for ground that most historians agree had almost no strategic value at all. German losses ran close to 28,000. Neither side was winning. Both sides were dying. The Americans were there because of the dams on the Ruhr River, upstream of the forest. Take the high ground and the dams behind it, the planners reasoned, and the road to the Rhine would open. Instead, division after division went into the trees and came out gutted. The 28th Infantry Division alone lost thousands of men fighting for a single small town, Schmidt, that changed hands within days of being captured. By the time the 4th Infantry Division moved into the line in mid-November, the forest had already chewed through one American division after another, and it was nowhere near finished with this one either. Lengfeld commanded the 2nd Company of the Fusilier Battalion, 275th Infantry Division. He was no stranger to this kind of fighting. He had already served and been wounded multiple times on the Eastern Front, where he'd been decorated for his service, before his unit was transferred west to face the Allied advance after Normandy. He had taken over the company only weeks earlier, in October, after his predecessor was killed in action. By the second week of November, his men were exhausted, lice-ridden, half-frozen, and badly under strength, the kind of company that existed in name more than in numbers after weeks of attrition in the trees. They were holding a position near a forester's lodge that both armies had fought over again and again, a structure that changed hands. So many nobody could say with certainty who truly held it from one night to the next. It offered some shelter from the cold and the rain, which, in November in the Ridden forest, was reason enough for both sides to keep fighting over a building that was barely standing. Beside that lodge sat a stretch of ground the Germans had nicknamed Wilde Sau, the Wild Sow. It was a minefield, sown thick with German anti-tank and anti-personnel mines, and it sat almost exactly between the two front lines. In the no-man's land both sides crossed only when they had to. On the night of November 11th into the 12th, American troops briefly retook the lodge, only to be pushed back out again by Lengfeld's men in the early morning hours. As the Americans pulled back under fire, one soldier ran straight into the Wild Sow, whether by accident, in the panic of the retreat, or because there was simply nowhere else to run. He didn't die instantly. He went down hard, badly wounded, and he started calling for help. And he kept calling. The Germans, dug in just yards away in their own foxholes, could hear every cry. In the stillness of a forest where artillery had been falling for weeks, a single human voice carries a very long way. Lengfeld's first order was simple, and it tells you almost everything about the man. He told his troops, if American medics come for that man, under no circumstances open fire. Let them through. A German machine gun covered the safe lane beside the minefield. Lengfeld made sure the gunner understood the order applied to him too. For a German officer in the 6th year of a brutal war, in a battle where both sides had been bleeding each other, white for wheat, and where snipers on both sides had already taken a toll on his company, that order alone was no small thing. It cost the Germans nothing tactically. It simply meant choosing, for a few hours, not to use a weapon they had every right under the rules of war to use. Then the hours started to pass. No American medics came. Maybe the Americans, retreating in disarray, believed the man was already dead. Maybe no one on their side even realized he was still out there, alive, in the open. From the German positions, all anyone could do was listen. Morning turned toward midday, and the wounded American kept crying out. The cries did not stop, and they did not get any weaker, in a way that would have told the Germans the man was slipping away on his own. By around 10:30 that morning, Lengfeld had reached his limit. He could not simply leave a man to die within earshot while doing nothing, even if that man wore an American uniform. The order to hold fire had been enough for hours, but it wasn't enough anymore. So he made a decision that went far beyond anything he'd already ordered. He would go get the American himself. He pulled together a small team from his own medical personnel, put them under the protection of the Red Cross, and led them out along the road himself rather than sending them alone. This was not a blind walk into danger. Lengfeld's company had laid the anti-tank mines on that stretch themselves, and he knew, or believed he knew, roughly where every one of them sat. He guided his team carefully along the road, past the markers and the disturbed ground that told him where the anti-tank mines were buried, moving toward the sound of the American's voice with his medics close behind him. He nearly made it. As Lengfeld stepped off that known, mapped path to cross the open ground toward the wounded man, he triggered a hidden anti-personnel mine, a smaller device, one his own company hadn't placed and had no record of, tucked into ground he had every reason to believe was safe. The blast tore into his back, ripping 2 deep wounds and causing severe internal injuries. He went down in agony, just yards from the man he had come to save, with his own medics frozen for a moment in shock at what they had just seen happen to the officer leading them. His own soldiers pulled him back. A lightly wounded NCO got him to the aid station at Lucas Mill, and from there he was moved to the main dressing station at Freudsheim. There was nothing more to be done. That evening, November 12, 1944, Lieutenant Friedrich Lengfeld died of his wounds. He was 23 years old. The minefield he had walked into wasn't finished taking lives. Just 5 days later, on November 17th, another German soldier, Alphonse Bossel, stepped on a mine in that same stretch of ground and was killed. The Wild Sow lived up to its name on both sides of the line, for both armies, again and again in a battle that ground on through that entire winter. His communications runner, Hubert Gies, was there for almost all of it, and it's because of Gies that we know this story at all. Decades later, Gies would say of his commander, "With Lieutenant Lengfeld, I lost the best superior I ever had. In the previous hard weeks he meant much to me and gave me a lot of inner strength. He was an exemplary company leader, and he claimed never more from us than he was willing to give by himself." Gies also remembered something smaller, almost a detail, but it tells you who Lengfeld was under fire. When he led patrols into dangerous ground, he never told his men to go check something out. He said, "Follow me." As for the American soldier in the minefield, his fate was never confirmed. Gies later speculated that the man may have made his own way back to American lines before the Germans retook that ground the following day. No record of his identity has ever surfaced. He remains to history, simply the man whose cries for help cost a German officer his life. Lengfeld was buried in the German military cemetery at Düren-Rollsdorf, one name among thousands. For 50 years, that was where the story ended, a small, almost unrecorded act of mercy in a battle that the U.S. Army itself would later describe as one of its costliest and least necessary fights of the entire war. Then, in 1994, on the 50th anniversary of the battle, a retired American Major General named John Ruggles went back to Hurtgen. Ruggles had been a young officer with the 22nd Infantry Regiment during the fighting, a regiment that had taken some of the heaviest losses of any single regiment in the entire Hurtgen campaign. He had walked that ground himself, as a much younger man, in the same cold and the same mud. He knew exactly what this forest had cost his own regiment, his own friends. And through Hubert Gies's account of what had happened in the Wild Sow minefield, an account Gies had carried with him for 50 years, Ruggles learned the story of the German lieutenant who had died trying to save one of his men. He decided that story deserved to be marked. Even if no one back home had ever heard of it, Ruggles organized veterans of the 22nd Infantry Society to fund and place a monument, not for an American, but for a German officer who had fought against them. On October 7, 1994, they traveled to Hurtgen and dedicated it at the entrance to the war cemetery there, among the more than 3,000 German war dead buried on that ground, including Lengfeld himself. Ruggles wasn't looking for attention. The dedication received no press coverage back in the United States. It was simply something a group of old soldiers felt needed to be done. The bronze plaque they placed carries a single line: "No man hath greater love than he who layeth down his life for his enemy." Ruggles, asked about it afterward, put it even more plainly. "You can't go to any greater extreme," he said, "than to give your life trying to rescue someone you're fighting as your enemy in war." Compare that, he added, to the indifference most people feel about each other today. It remains, by the historical record, the only monument American soldiers have ever placed in a German war cemetery to honor a Wehrmacht soldier's act in the Second World War, a rare, twin to a similar memorial later raised in the Netherlands for another German soldier, Karl-Heinz Rosch, who died trying to save Dutch civilians. What makes Lengfeld's story endure isn't that it changes anything about the war itself. The Hürtgen Forest was still one of the bloodiest, most pointless battles the U.S. Army ever fought, a fight that senior commanders on both sides would later be criticized for prolonging far longer than the ground was worth. The regime Lengfeld served was responsible for horrors that this single act of decency does nothing to balance and nothing to excuse. The thousands of American dead in that forest, and the tens of thousands of German dead beside them, were not redeemed by one rescue that failed. But amid 30,000 American casualties and 28,000 German ones, in a forest where men on both sides had been killing each other for weeks without mercy, one 23-year-old company commander heard a stranger crying for help, an enemy, a man wearing the wrong uniform, in the middle of his own minefield, and decided that was reason enough to risk everything he had. He never reached him. We don't even know if the American lived. Guise later guessed the man might have crawled or been carried back to his own lines before the Germans retook that ground the next day, but no record was ever found to confirm it either way. We don't even know his name, and in all likelihood we never will. But 50 years on, the men Lengfeld had been fighting walked back into that forest, stood among their own dead and his, and told the story anyway. Not because it changed the outcome of a single battle, and not because it made the Hürtgen Forest any less of a slaughterhouse for the men who fought through it. They told it because, in a war fought on an almost unimaginable scale, one young officer's choice to climb into a minefield for an enemy he never met was a small, true thing, and 50 years later, a group of old soldiers decided that was still worth walking back into the woods to remember.